Today on Encore, the French photographer who captured the birth of a nation.
When I heard about the beginning of the conflict, I thought, if I went there, I would really be sort of witnessing history in the making.
Anne de Henning travelled through Bangladesh in the early 70s during the War of Independence, photographing freedom fighters, families, refugee trains and women fleeing villages.
We were fighting for our independence. We were fighting to speak our own language. And it was all led by the father of our nation, Bangabandhu.
He wanted a country that was secular. He wanted a country which was equal for all.
To mark the 50th anniversary of Bangladesh's independence, Paris's Guimet Museum is hosting an exhibition of Anne de Henning's work. It's called Witnessing History in the Making. And I'm delighted to welcome Anne de Henning to the show. Hello.
Thank you very much. Hello.
Thank you for being here. Now, just over 50 years ago, you went to Bangladesh to capture history in the making. How do you remember that time?
Very intense. I was in Kathmandu when I read in the news that fighting had erupted in Dhaka, and that the Pakistani authorities had banned members of the press from entering the country. Also, I heard of massacres taking place in Dhaka perpetrated against the civilian population. And I was a young photojournalist, and I thought it was a challenge and to go into the country in spite of the ban. I was very motivated. So I flew to Calcutta, and after several failed attempts to cross the border near Calcutta, I teamed up with 3 fellow members of the press, and we rented a run-down car, had a driver, and we drove further north and managed to convince the border security forces to let us in. And then from there on, that was the war. People were very poorly equipped in those days. That was extremely striking, but they were extremely determined and very courageous and ready to die for the independence of their country.
To give people some background, Bangladesh was created at the end of 1971 in what was previously East Pakistan. Around 3 million people died in a 9-month war that ended with Pakistan's surrender. 10 million people became refugees. You'd, as you said, already worked as a photojournalist in the 60s covering the Vietnam War, and when you were 23. You were 26 when you went to Bangladesh. Tell us a bit about the experience, what it was like there.
The people were all intent on achieving independence, and they were ready to fight with any means they had. They were very poorly equipped in armament, and they were asking my colleagues to convey to the world their need for modern military equipment. One very striking scene was when I was taken to see a group of men, including children, showing their determination and readiness to fight with bows and arrows. That's one of the most striking scenes I saw. Of course, there were scenes that you see everywhere in the war, with the houses bearing the scar of bombardment, bombing by the Pakistani Sabre jets. I mean, that particular situation. But everywhere you saw people ready to fight and asking for help. That was very moving also, because it was the very, very early days of the fighting in April.
I wanted to ask you about some of your images in particular. Tell us about this one. There's a young man holding a gun on his back. Tell us about that.
Oh, that was one of the first striking images of a freedom fighter I came across and photographed. He's bare-chested, wrapped in a lungi, walking briskly to join his combat unit, I would imagine. And he's carrying, slung over his shoulder, one of these very old British guns, Lee Enfield 303. And that was only but one of the fighters I ran across who was carrying that type of gun. And on the last day I was in Bangladesh, there was a fight erupted in the night when the Pakistanis were crossing the Padma River, fighting against the Mukti Bahinis, because there were only 20 guns for 300 people who were sort of massed in front of the small headquarters in Golondogat. So this particular detail, well, I wouldn't say detail, but in the photographs, that was something extremely striking.
Like the lack of weapons.
Lack of weapons, which they were asking for. Every time we stopped, in a railway station or elsewhere, masses of people would come and say, convey to the world our need.
Another photograph that struck me was one of a family. Talk to us about this image. We can see the people leaving, a family leaving.
Well, that was an image among many others of entire families leaving the country, or at least trying to flee the conflict zones. And some were walking, some were on foot, some were in horse carriages, and some were trying to board a train to reach Calcutta, if possible. And what is very striking there is that it's an entire family. You have the mother, the children, and one of them is carrying a live duck and a transistor radio.
I didn't notice that until you said it.
Yes.
I'm so busy looking at the people, but yeah, there's a live duck in the photo. You also photographed the father of the nation, Banga Bandhu, in person and covered the speech he made after the US officially recognised Bangladesh as a nation. He was, of course, assassinated 3 years later. His grandson visited the Paris exhibition.
Mm-hmm.
What was Banga Bandhu like?
What struck me most was his charisma, the intensity and his voice, when he was giving out his speech. Of course, I don't speak Bengali, so I couldn't really tell what he was saying. But there was also a contrast between the sort of the gesture when he was speaking and the quietness when he was sitting, smoking his pipe or drinking a glass of water, or looking, at his notes. That sort of strong personality that could sort of stop and think and go on, further. That was something I felt strongly in his temperament.
And half a century on, during the past 50 years, have you been back to Bangladesh?
I'm going back to Bangladesh in December because thanks to the Samdani Art Foundation, this show was first seen in Bangladesh in 2021 for the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the independence. And now they're going to stage it again for Victory Day in December as well. But it's very important to me that it's exhibited now at Musée Guimet, because very little is known of the story of the independence of Bangladesh. And there are very few portraits of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman surviving him, because the archives were destroyed after the coup, where 15 persons of his family and his entourage were assassinated in 1975.
So it's definitely worth people going to visit your exhibition at the Musée Guimet. November does seem to be photo month in Paris, with a host of exhibitions and festivals taking place. A few worth looking for include a retrospective of the Ukrainian photographer Boris Mihailov's work at the European House of Photography, or the MEP, the MEP. Considered one of the most influential contemporary artists from Eastern Europe, he's been developing a body of experimental work exploring social and political subjects for more than 50 years. Titled Ukrainian Diary, it shows a different Ukraine to the one we're seeing in the news. It was planned before the Russian invasion. And do you think, with all the images coming out of Ukraine, and people are starting to get desensitized by what's happening by the war?
I don't think you can ever get desensitized to images of war, because they're always about separation, death, destruction. All wars end up showing, these same pictures and the same awful results of what fighting brings upon the civilians and also, of course, the fighters. So I don't think anyone should be desensitized. I don't think anyone can get desensitized.
Okay, well, that exhibition shows another side of Ukraine as the images were taken before the war. Other star photographers being celebrated in Paris this month include the British photographer Martin Parr. He spoke to France 24 about his latest show, Martin Parr's Ireland, at the Irish Cultural Centre. He chatted to Olivia Salazar-Winspear about Morris Minors, Catholicism and the Celtic tiger.
I don't think that I can think of any other country, possibly Albania, that has changed as dramatically as Ireland has in a 40-year period. I guess the biggest change was the demise of the church, because back in '79, 2/3 of the population went to see the Pope during that visit. And 30 years later, when the next Pope came, only 1/3 of the people of the country showed up.
You can watch the full interview on our website. You can also find out on our website about the American photographer of female nudes, Renee Jacobs, who was on our Encore page, on our Encore show. And Renee Jacobs' photo books are called Paris and Polaroids, and her exhibition, Dreams and Desires, is being shown at Cine in Paris. The artist talked to me about the frightening power of female sexuality, why the terms female and male gaze are reductive, and the effect the city of Paris has on women. Now I'm in the studio with the French photographer Anne de Henning, whose exhibition History in the Making is on show at Paris's Guimet Museum. Now, you've chosen another exhibition as your cultural pick of the moment to talk to us about. Tell us.
I was struck by the current exhibition Monet, Joan Mitchell at the Fondation Louis Vuitton, which brings together both giants and shows a dialogue between their works. Apparently, Joan Mitchell denied any influence by Monet, but the exhibition says otherwise. And it's a sheer visual delight to see their works confronting each other.
Okay, Anne de Henning, we're going to play out with that. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. And thanks for your company. We'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Special events. Join us for in-depth coverage of the greatest sporting competition. Around the world, fans can barely contain their excitement. In Qatar, the launch is just around the corner. Adrenaline and emotions are sky high. Get World Cup fever on France 24 and France24.com.